The rain fell in thin gray sheets, slicking the asphalt of the crosswalk until it mirrored the bruised November sky. Leo clutched the straps of his backpack, the frayed nylon digging into his palms. One strap was holding on by a few stubborn threads, a metaphor for his own endurance. He was 12, but felt ancient, worn thin by a world that seemed to operate just beyond a pane of soundproof glass. He could see it, but he couldn't touch it, and it certainly never seemed to notice him. Cars hissed past, their headlights smearing across the wet street. The crossing guard, a woman with a perpetually tired face, blew her whistle with a sigh, and the river of metal grudgingly parted. Leo scurried across, his worn sneakers soaking through in seconds. He was a ghost in a faded blue jacket, a small, hunched figure against the indifferent backdrop of the city. The backpack strap, subjected to one too many hurried journeys, finally gave way. With a soft, pathetic rip, it tore free. His books, his sketchbook, his entire fragile world tumbled onto the wet pavement. A history textbook slid open, its pages immediately darkening with rain. A handful of pencils rolled toward a gutter, lost forever. For a moment, Leo just stood there, paralyzed. It wasn't the books. It was the finality of the snap, another small thing in his life that had broken beyond repair. No one stopped. A woman with a bright red umbrella navigated around him as if he were a puddle. A man in a suit glanced down, his expression a flat mask of annoyance, before hurrying on. This was his reality, to be an obstacle, a minor inconvenience in the lives of others. He knelt, his jeans instantly saturated with cold, and began gathering his things. His sketchbook, the most precious object he owned, was splayed open. A drawing of a soaring eagle, its wings rendered in meticulous pencil strokes, was now bleeding into a gray, blurry mess. A lump formed in his throat, hot and hard. He blinked back tears, refusing to let them fall. Crying didn't fix anything. It just made your eyes puffy and your throat ache. He shoved the ruined drawing and the soaked books back into the now unbalanced bag, slinging the one remaining strap over his shoulder. He walked the rest of the way to school with a pronounced list, a ship taking on water, trying to make it to a port that offered no real safety. Leo's silence had begun a year ago, on a day much like this one, when two police officers had stood on his doorstep, their hats in their hands and their voices soft, with a practiced, useless sympathy. His parents, they had explained, were gone. A patch of black ice, a spinning truck, a finality as swift and senseless as the snap of his backpack strap. He had moved in with his uncle, Marcus, his father's younger brother. Marcus was a good man, but he was a man adrift. He worked as a mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease, his own grief a heavy cloak he wore day and night. Their small apartment was tidy, but bare, filled with the ghosts of a life that was supposed to have been different. Marcus tried. He made Leo toast in the mornings and asked about school, but his eyes were often distant, lost in a place Leo couldn't reach. The silence became Leo's shield. At school, he was the quiet kid in the back row, the one teachers forgot to call on. He ate his lunch alone, using the time to draw in his sketchbook. Drawing was the only language he had left. He could pour all the noise in his head, the screech of tires, the hollow echo in the apartment, the ache of loneliness, onto the page. He drew motorcycles with intricate engines, mythical creatures with powerful wings, and portraits of people whose eyes held stories he could only imagine. His art was his voice, and he guarded it fiercely. The school system had tried in its own clumsy way. A grief counselor with kind eyes and a box of tissues had met with him twice. She had asked him to use his words, but his words were trapped behind a wall of shock and loss, and he had nothing to offer her but the same silence he offered everyone else. Eventually, the appointment stopped. He was just another file in a cabinet, a box checked, a problem that had, on paper, been addressed. He learned self-reliance not as a virtue but as a necessity. He learned to patch his own jeans, to make his own sandwiches when Marcus worked late, to navigate the city's bus routes alone. He learned that the world was loud and busy, and if you were quiet, you could disappear completely. Sometimes he felt like he was watching his own life from a great distance, a movie about a sad little boy that he couldn't turn off. The broken backpack was just the latest scene in that movie, a small, mundane tragedy that felt disproportionately large because it was his, and his alone, to carry. The Ironclad Brethren Motorcycle Club was not what most people imagined when they heard the words biker gang. Their clubhouse, a converted warehouse at the industrial edge of town, was meticulously clean. The concrete floor was swept. Tools were hung on pegboards in perfect order, and the chrome on the row of parked motorcycles gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Their code was simple and unwritten, passed down through action rather than words. You take care of your own, you protect the innocent, and you never, ever abide a bully. Their president, a man they called Saint, was a former army sergeant with a quiet intensity that commanded more respect than any shouted order. His face was a roadmap of hard-won experience, but his eyes were clear and steady. He had seen the worst of humanity overseas and had returned with a fierce, unwavering commitment to building a pocket of integrity in a world that often lacked it. Tonight they were gathered for their weekly meeting. The air smelled of motor oil, brewing coffee, and worn leather. Marcus was there, sitting quietly at the long wooden table, nursing a mug of coffee. He wasn't a full-patch member, just an affiliate who worked on their bikes. But the brethren had taken him under their wing after his brother's death. They saw the weight he carried and offered him the one thing he needed most, a silent, solid wall of support. They didn't pry or offer platitudes. They just made sure he had a hot meal, a place to be, and the low, comforting rumble of engines to fill the silence. Wrench, the club's lead mechanic and treasurer, a man who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, was going over the accounts. Doc, a retired paramedic who still carried a trauma kit on his bike, was methodically cleaning his riding glasses. They were men of routine and discipline. Many were veterans, men who understood chain of command and the importance of watching each other's backs. They had seen systems fail and had decided to build their own system, one based on loyalty and a rigid moral compass. They were protectors by nature, a trait forged in crucibles most people couldn't comprehend. They knew that true strength wasn't about intimidation. It was about having the power to shield those who had none. They had a fund they used to help struggling families in the community. They organized toy drives at Christmas, and more than once, they had provided a silent, leather-clad escort for women leaving abusive relationships. They did these things without fanfare, because their code demanded it. It was simply what you did. Marcus rarely spoke about Leo at the clubhouse, but they all knew about the boy. They had seen him, a small shadow at his uncle's side, his eyes wide and observant. They saw the way he studied their bikes, the careful detail in the sketches he sometimes left on the workbench. In him, they saw a vulnerability that triggered every protective instinct they possessed. They knew that Marcus was doing his best, but they also knew that grief was a powerful tide that could pull a man under. So they watched from a respectful distance, ready to be the anchor if he, or the boy, ever started to drift too far out. The next day, Leo walked to school with his books cradled in his arms. The single-strapped backpack was useless. He felt exposed, his lack of resources on public display. He slipped into his homeroom just as the bell rang, avoiding eye contact, and made his way to his desk in the back. His first period teacher was Mr. Albright, a man who wielded sarcasm like a weapon and seemed to derive a smug satisfaction from the discomfort of his students. He was handsome in a polished, brittle way, with a perfect smile that never reached his eyes. He prided himself on running a tight ship, but his discipline often veered into casual cruelty. He noticed Leo immediately. "Mr. Torres," he began, his voice smooth and condescending, "have we abandoned the pretense of preparedness altogether, or is carrying your books like a sack of groceries the new trend I've yet to read about in my educator's journal?" A few students snickered. Leo felt a hot flush creep up his neck. He mumbled, "My backpack broke." "It broke?" Albright repeated, feigning theatrical surprise. He walked slowly down the aisle and stopped beside Leo's desk. He gestured at Leo's worn jacket and his patched jeans. "Things seem to be breaking a lot around you, don't they? Tell me, does your father—" "No, it's an uncle, isn't it? Does he ever take a break from polishing his noisy little motorcycle to ensure his nephew has the basic equipment for school?" The mention of Marcus, of his bike, was a deliberate, targeted strike. Albright had seen Marcus pick Leo up once, his face a mask of disdain. He saw a man with greasy hands and a leather jacket and made 1,000 assumptions. "He's a mechanic," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. "He fixes things." "Oh, he fixes things," Albright chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "That's wonderful, but he seems to have overlooked a $10 backpack. I suppose it's hard to focus on scholastic necessities when you're busy being— what is it they call themselves? Some kind of weekend warrior brotherhood? How utterly charming. It's a shame all that leather and chrome can't buy a child a functional bag. It just goes to show you how utterly useless some people's priorities are." That was it. The word useless. It landed on Leo like a physical blow. He thought of Marcus, his face etched with exhaustion after a 12-hour shift, carefully setting aside money for groceries. He thought of the quiet way Marcus had tried to fix the broken toaster last week, his brow furrowed in concentration, refusing to give up. He thought of the low, steady rumble of his uncle's bike, the one sound that made him feel safe. Something inside Leo, something that had been dormant for a year, finally snapped. He stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. The classroom went silent. "He's not useless," Leo said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that stunned the room. It was clear, firm, and devoid of fear. "He's the best person I know. He works harder than anyone. And his motorcycle isn't noisy. It's strong. And he's not a weekend warrior. He's my family." Mr. Albright's smile faltered. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by the silent boy in the back row. For a split second, his mask of polished authority slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, ugly anger. "Sit down, Mr. Torres," he said, his voice dangerously low. Leo remained standing. He had said his piece. He had spoken the truth, and the truth was now hanging in the air, undeniable. He had defended his uncle. He had defended his family. That afternoon, when Marcus arrived to pick him up, he found Leo waiting on the curb, his books clutched to his chest, his face pale but his eyes resolute. Marcus saw the broken backpack in the trash can nearby. "Leo, what happened?" For the first time in a year, Leo looked directly at his uncle and used his words. He told him everything. Marcus listened, his knuckles white as he gripped the handlebars of his bike. He didn't say a word until Leo was finished. Then he simply nodded. "Get on," he said, his voice a low rumble like an engine turning over. "We're going for a ride." He didn't take Leo home. He took him to the clubhouse. The next morning, Mr. Albright was writing an equation on the whiteboard when the classroom door opened. He didn't look up, assuming it was a tardy student. "Punctuality, people, is a cornerstone of respect," he said without turning around, an early sign of a disciplined mind. "We agree," a low voice said from the doorway. The voice was calm, but it had the density of granite. It did not belong to a student. Albright turned. Standing in the doorway was a man who seemed to take up all the available space. He was tall and broad, with a shaved head and a neatly trimmed gray beard. He wore a clean, pressed leather vest over a simple black shirt. The vest was adorned with a single, intricate patch, a shield crossed by a wrench and a hammer with the words "Ironclad Brethren" stitched in silver thread. This was Saint. Behind him, silent and still, stood 4 other men. They were all large, all wearing the same vest, their expressions unreadable. They didn't look angry or threatening. They looked patient. They looked immovable. The 25 students in the room held their breath. The air crackled with a sudden, intense pressure. Mr. Albright's polished smile flickered on, a nervous tick. "Can I help you, gentlemen? This is a classroom. I'm afraid you've made a mistake." Saint took one slow step into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "We're not mistaken," he said, his eyes locking onto Albright's. "We're here to observe. We heard you have some strong opinions on what constitutes a useful member of society. We're interested in your educational philosophy." He gestured toward the back of the room. "We'll just be in the back. Please, continue your lesson." The 5 men moved with an unnerving, disciplined quiet. They didn't swagger. They flowed. They arranged themselves along the back wall, their arms crossed, their presence filling every corner of the room. They weren't there to cause violence. They were there to bear witness. Their silence was more intimidating than any threat could ever be. Albright's composure began to fray at the edges. He turned back to the whiteboard, but his hand was trembling slightly. The chalk squeaked against the board. He tried to resume his lesson on algebraic expressions, but his words came out stilted, his confidence evaporating under the weight of 5 steady, silent gazes. He could feel their eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. He made a mistake in the equation. A student, emboldened by the shift in power, pointed it out. "Mr. Albright, shouldn't that be a -7? Albright's head snapped around. "What?" he stammered, his face flushing. He looked at the board, then back at the student. His usual sarcastic retort died on his lips. He couldn't find it. The silent figures in the back hadn't moved a muscle, yet they had stripped him of his primary weapon. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. It sounded like a reprieve. "Class dismissed," Albright croaked, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. The students filed out, their eyes wide, whispering amongst themselves. They left in a hurry, sensing the charged atmosphere. Soon only Albright and the 5 men remained. Saint walked slowly to the front of the classroom. He stopped at Leo's empty desk. He ran a hand over the scarred wood, then looked at Albright. "A boy's desk," Saint said, his voice still quiet, still calm. "A place where he's supposed to feel safe to learn, not a place to be ridiculed for his family, or for the clothes on his back, or for a broken bag he didn't ask for." Albright puffed out his chest, a desperate attempt to reclaim his authority. "I am a teacher. I am responsible for the discipline and standards in this classroom. I will not be intimidated by—" "By what?" Saint interrupted, his voice dropping half an octave. "By fathers, by uncles, by men who believe that a child's dignity is more important than a teacher's ego. You wanted to talk about priorities, Mr. Albright. Let's talk about them." He took another step closer. "You judged a man by the grease on his hands. Let me tell you about that man. That man is raising his brother's son after a tragedy that would have broken most people. That man works 60 hours a week to keep a roof over that boy's head. The grease on his hands pays for the food on that boy's plate. So you are going to stand here and listen. You are going to learn what the word useless really means. It means a man who uses his position of power to belittle a child who has already lost everything. That, Mr. Albright, is the definition of useless. The truth of the words, delivered with such quiet, unshakable conviction, seemed to physically knock the air out of the teacher. His polished veneer shattered completely, leaving only a petty, frightened man in its place. The confrontation was over. No one had laid a hand on him, but Mr. Albright had been utterly and completely dismantled. The silent visit from the ironclad brethren was like a stone dropped into the still, murky pond of Northwood Middle School. The ripples spread quickly, whispers filled the hallways. Students who had long endured Mr. Albright's subtle cruelties now exchanged knowing glances. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered, but Saint knew a single confrontation was not a solution. It was a catalyst. The real work had just begun. That afternoon, Marcus and Saint requested a meeting with the principal, Ms. Evans. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman who had been at the helm of the school for a decade. She greeted them in her office, her expression wary. She had already heard a dozen conflicting versions of the morning's events. "I want to be very clear," she began, her hands folded on her desk. "I do not condone unauthorized visitors, especially those who disrupt a learning environment." Saint nodded respectfully. "We understand, Principal Evans. We did not come to disrupt. We came to listen. We will not be returning to a classroom, but we are not leaving either. A line was crossed, and we are here to see that it is addressed." He then placed a large, new-looking sketchbook on her desk. "This belongs to Leo Torres," he said. He opened it to a specific page. The drawing was of a boy, small and alone, huddled under a large thorny bush, while shadowy figures with cruel smiles loomed over him. The detail was heartbreaking. He turned the page. Another drawing, a report card with a failing grade, but the grade was morphing into a monster with sharp teeth. Page after page, Leo's sketchbook was a silent testament to his year of grief and isolation, a visual diary of his anxiety and fear. "Leo doesn't always use his words," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, "but he speaks. You just have to know how to listen." Ms. Evans looked at the drawings, her stern expression softening into something more complex. She was an educator, and she recognized this for what it was, a cry for help that had gone unanswered. The institutional gears, long dormant, began to turn. Ms. Evans called in the school counselor, Mrs. Gable, the same woman who had met with Leo a year ago. She looked at the sketchbook, and a flicker of shame crossed her face. I thought he was just quiet," she admitted. "I didn't push. I didn't see." "It's time to see," Saint said gently. Mrs. Gable began a quiet investigation. She started by talking to other students from Albright's classes. At first, they were hesitant, afraid of retribution. But the story of the silent bikers in the back of the room had emboldened them. A girl named Sarah admitted that Mr. Albright had mockingly called her Miss Millionaire for a week because her family couldn't afford the field trip fee. Another boy, David, explained how Albright had read a personal, poorly written poem of his aloud to the class, dissecting it with cruel sarcasm. A pattern began to emerge. Mr. Albright wasn't a tough teacher. He was a bully who preyed on the vulnerable. He targeted students who were poor or shy or different, students he knew were unlikely to fight back. The evidence was not a single dramatic event, but 1,000 tiny cuts, a long-term campaign of emotional attrition. An ally emerged from an unexpected place, a younger teacher, Mr. Chen, who had his classroom across the hall from Albright, came forward. He told Ms. Evans he had often heard Albright's raised voice, the sharp, mocking tone that carried through the walls. He'd always felt it was wrong, but had been too intimidated as a new teacher to report a tenured veteran. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," he said, his shame palpable. The sketchbook had become the key. Leo's drawings gave a visual language to the emotional harm Albright inflicted, making it tangible and undeniable. It was no longer just a case of a teacher being too strict. It was a documented pattern of abuse. Ms. Evans, armed with testimony from students, a corroborating colleague, and the powerful silent evidence of Leo's art, knew she could no longer treat this as a simple disciplinary issue. She picked up her phone and made a call to the district superintendent. The system, prodded into action, was finally beginning to wake up. The school district launched a formal investigation. A hearing was scheduled. The news spread through the community, fracturing it into factions. There were the defenders of Mr. Albright, parents who saw him as a respectable, demanding educator whose methods got results. They wrote letters to the editor, praising his high standards and dismissing the complaints as the whining of oversensitive children and their thuggish parents. They saw the ironclad brethren as a menace, a group of intimidating outsiders who had no place in school affairs. Then there were the supporters, a growing number of families who had long harbored private concerns about Albright's methods. The investigation gave them the courage to come forward. The school board meeting became a public spectacle. The auditorium was packed. On one side sat the well-dressed, indignant supporters of the teacher. On the other side sat a quieter, more diverse group of parents, including Sarah's mother and David's father. And in the back, filling the last 3 rows, sat the ironclad brethren. They were a silent, solid presence. They wore their vests, but made no sound, no gestures. They were simply there, a quiet promise of solidarity. Their presence made some people nervous, but for the families who had felt voiceless for so long, it was a profound comfort. They were not alone. St. Marcus and a few other members sat in the front row with Leo, who was flanked by his uncle and the big, calm man who had become his staunchest defender. The public comment period was a storm of conflicting emotions. One father stood up and decried the motorcycle gang for intimidating a dedicated teacher. A mother tearfully defended Albright, saying he had pushed her son to get into an advanced program. Then Sarah's mother took the podium. Her hands trembled as she held a piece of paper. "My daughter was called Miss Millionaire because I am a single mother working 2 jobs, she said, her voice shaking but clear. She was shamed for our poverty. That is not a high standard. That is cruelty. David's father spoke next. He was a large man who worked in construction, and he looked deeply uncomfortable. My boy, he likes to write. Albright made the whole class laugh at him. My son hasn't written a word since. Don't tell me about discipline. That's not discipline. That's breaking a kid's spirit. The tide in the room began to turn. The narrative was shifting from a simple story of an intimidating biker gang to a more complex one about a teacher's abuse of power. The brethren's role was also being reevaluated. They weren't aggressors. They were equalizers. They had lent their strength to those who had none, creating a space where the truth could finally be spoken. The media picked up the story. A local news crew filmed outside the meeting, interviewing parents on both sides. The image of the silent bikers sitting in the back of the auditorium was broadcast across the city, a powerful visual that sparked a wider conversation about bullying, accountability, and the role of community in protecting its children. The public reckoning was messy and loud, but it was necessary. It forced an entire community to look at itself, to question its assumptions, and to decide what it truly valued. For Leo, sitting between his uncle and Saint, the experience was overwhelming but not frightening. For the first time, he felt seen. The world was no longer a pane of soundproof glass. He was in the room, and his voice, through his drawings and his quiet courage, was finally being heard. The formal hearing was held in a sterile, impersonal room at the district office. It lacked the public drama of the school board meeting, but the stakes were much higher. This was where Mr. Albright's fate would be decided. The panel consisted of the superintendent, a district lawyer, and a senior union representative. Mr. Albright sat at one table with his own lawyer, looking composed but with a telltale tightness around his mouth. At the other table sat Leo, Marcus, and Ms. Evans. Saint and Doc from the Brethren sat in the chairs behind them, a quiet, reassuring presence. Albright's lawyer began by painting his client as a victim, a dedicated teacher hounded by a vindictive family and their intimidating biker friends. He tried to dismiss the students' testimonies as childish exaggerations, but Ms. Evans was prepared. She presented a meticulously compiled file, signed statements from 7 different students, a formal report from the counselor, Mrs. Gable, and the written testimony from the teacher, Mr. Chen. The evidence was systematic and damning. Then she placed Leo's sketchbook in the center of the table. "This," she said, "is the most important piece of evidence. This is a year in the life of a child who felt invisible, who was grieving, and who was targeted by the very person meant to nurture his education." The panel members looked through the sketchbook in silence. The drawings of monsters, of shadows, of isolating cages, told a story more powerful than any spoken testimony. Finally, the superintendent looked at Leo. "Leo," she said gently, "can you tell us in your own words what happened in class that day?" Leo looked at Marcus, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He looked at Saint, whose steady gaze seemed to say, "You have the truth. Just speak it." He took a deep breath. "He said my uncle was useless," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady. "He made fun of his motorcycle. He said he couldn't even buy me a backpack. But my uncle, he's not useless. He takes care of me. He works all the time. And he's all I have." He looked directly at Mr. Albright. "It's not right to say that about someone's family. It's not right to make a kid feel bad because they don't have a lot of money." The simple, honest words of a child cut through all the legal maneuvering and adult justifications. It was the heart of the matter. Albright's lawyer tried to object, to frame it as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. Their decision was unanimous. Mr. Albright was found to have engaged in a pattern of unprofessional conduct and emotional abuse. His teaching license was suspended pending a full state review, and his contract was terminated, effective immediately. As they left the room, Mr. Albright shot a venomous glare at Leo and the men with him. But the glare held no power anymore. He was just a man who had lost his job, his reputation stripped away by the truth. Outside, in the hallway, Marcus knelt and pulled Leo into a fierce hug. "I am so proud of you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You are the strongest person I know." Saint placed a heavy, comforting hand on Leo's shoulder. "Courage isn't about being loud, kid," he said. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when your voice shakes." Justice had been delivered, not by fists or threats, but by evidence, by testimony, and by the unwavering courage of a quiet boy who had finally found his voice. The firing of Mr. Albright was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a transformation. The events at Northwood Middle School had exposed a systemic weakness, and the community, now fully awakened, was determined to fix it. Ms. Evans, deeply affected by her own initial failure to see the problem, spearheaded the reforms. The first change was the implementation of the Leo's Law initiative, a new district-wide student protection policy. It established a clear, confidential channel for students to report emotional abuse or bullying by staff, with a guarantee of no retaliation. The policy was outlined on bright, newly laminated posters hung in every classroom and hallway. They featured a soaring eagle at the top, a design taken directly from one of Leo's sketches. The school district also made comprehensive training mandatory for all teachers and staff on recognizing signs of emotional distress, trauma, and poverty-related stress in students. Mrs. Gable, the counselor, led many of these sessions, using Leo's story, with Marcus's permission, as a powerful anonymous case study on the importance of looking beyond the surface. The ironclad brethren, once viewed with suspicion, became unlikely community partners. Their silent, steady support for the families had earned them a new respect. Wrench, the club's mechanic, volunteered to start an after-school program at the middle school, teaching basic engine mechanics and shop skills. It became wildly popular, especially with kids who, like Leo, learned better by doing than by sitting in a classroom. Doc gave talks at school health classes on emergency preparedness and basic first aid. Their involvement was a quiet, constant reminder that strength could and should be used to build, not to break. The most significant change, however, was in the atmosphere of the school itself. The culture of fear and silence that Albright had cultivated was replaced by one of openness and support. Students felt empowered to speak up. Teachers felt more connected to their students' well-being. The community had learned a vital lesson. Protecting children was everyone's responsibility. Marcus and Leo's lives were also profoundly changed. The ordeal had forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. Marcus started spending more time at home, the heavy cloak of his grief finally beginning to lift. He realized that being a guardian wasn't just about providing food and shelter. It was about being present. He started helping Leo with his homework, and they began rebuilding an old bicycle together in the apartment's small courtyard. The ironclad brethren officially adopted them. Leo was no longer just the mechanic's nephew, he was the kid. He had a dozen gruff, leather-clad uncles who would show up for his school art shows and parent-teacher conferences. They taught him how to change the oil on a bike and how to stand firm in the face of injustice. They gave him a family, a loud, loyal, and loving one, built not on blood, but on a shared code of honor. The legacy of that one confrontation in the classroom was not one of fear, but of healing. It had torn down a broken system and inspired the community to build something better and stronger in its place, ensuring that no child would ever feel as invisible as Leo Torres once had. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the yard behind the ironclad Brethren clubhouse. The air was filled with the smell of barbecue smoke and the sound of easy laughter. It was a year to the day since the hearing. The Brethren were having their annual summer cookout, and the guest list had expanded. Sarah and her mother were there, as were David and his father. Mr. Chen, the teacher who had spoken up, was talking animatedly with Wrench about the after-school mechanics club. The community that had been forged in the fire of the controversy was now a network of friends. Leo sat at a picnic table, his sketchbook open. He was no longer drawing monsters or shadows. Today he was sketching a portrait of Saint, who was laughing at something Doc had said. He captured the crinkles around the man's eyes, the genuine warmth that radiated from him. His art was no longer a shield against the world. It was a way of celebrating it. Marcus stood at the grill, flipping burgers next to a man named Preacher, another member of the club. He looked younger, the deep lines of exhaustion on his face softened. He caught Leo's eye and smiled, a real, unburdened smile. It was a smile Leo now saw every day. Later, as dusk settled, Saint walked over and sat down next to Leo. He looked at the drawing. "You've got a real gift, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You see people, really see them." He pulled a small, flat box from his vest pocket and slid it across the table. "The Brethren wanted you to have this." Leo opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a silver pendant on a leather cord. It was a perfect miniature replica of the ironclad Brethren's shield patch. It wasn't a membership. It was a promise. It meant he was one of them. He was protected. He was family. "For courage," Saint said simply. Leo looked up, his eyes shining. He didn't need to use his words. His expression said everything. He slipped the pendant over his head. the cool metal a comforting weight against his chest. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of belonging that he thought he had lost forever. The world was still a loud and sometimes difficult place, but it was no longer indifferent. It was a place where a quiet boy could be heard, where a broken family could be made whole, and where a group of men on motorcycles could be the staunchest of guardians. As night fell, the bikes began to rumble to life. It was time for the brethren to ride. They didn't ride with aggression or menace, but with a steady, powerful grace. Their headlights cut through the darkness, a moving constellation of loyalty and honor. Marcus put his arm around Leo's shoulders as they watched them go. "They're good men," Marcus said. "The best," Leo agreed, his hand instinctively going to the shield around his neck. He knew that somewhere out on those dark roads, the world was a little bit safer because someone had paid attention. He was living proof. And as he stood there, feeling the steady warmth of his uncle's arm and the low, fading rumble of the engines in his chest, Leo Torres knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, truly home.